Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to talk about genetically high cholesterol or familial hypercholesterolemia, and whether or not it creates higher risk of heart disease. But also, do people actually have it who've been told that they have it? So let's kind of get into it. So first off, people with familial hypercholesterolemia are people who have much higher levels of LDL than the average person. Now, first of all, we need to discuss that, the levels of what's recommended for LDL have been lowered over the years. In the 1980s, they said, oh, 250 or lower is what it should be. And then over the years, the recommendation went to 200 and then 150 and then 100. And now it should be lower than 100 is what they're saying. So to me, that suggests we really don't even know what it's supposed to be. But typically, people who have familiar hypercholesterolemia, this genetically high cholesterol, have much higher levels than the 100 that's considered normal, right? Now, it's said that if you look it up online, it'll say that like 1.3 million people are affected by familial hypercholesterolemia, this genetically high cholesterol. But they say that like only 10% of people who have it are actually aware of it, which to me, it's like if you have a condition that is so bad for you, but only 10% of people are aware they actually have it, doesn't sound like much of a condition to me. So it's just something that I want to point out there. But the American Heart Association website says that familial hypercholesterolemia gives people about a 20 times increased risk of heart disease. And that's just an interesting thing to say. So let's see if there's any substantial research that shows that. But first of all, I want to say that based on the amount of people that have FH, they say 1.3 million people have it. The number of people that I see as potential clients that come and tell me that their doctor has told them that they have genetically high cholesterol, the statistics don't match up. I mean, I see a lot of people on who are already adopting low carb diets. And so potentially more of those people will have higher LDL, and there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's still a more than what I would say statistically relevant amount of people come to me saying that their doctor has told them this. So let's try and explain why this is. So there's these new ideas out there that have been put forth by Dave Feldman and Nick Norwoods and his research team, their research team, about this lipid energy model. And it's a completely different way of understanding what the LDL or the cholesterol lipoproteins in our blood actually mean. So basically, what Dave found is that when he goes on a low carb diet, his LDL goes up. And what he found in researching why this would be is that in generally leaner and fitter people, if they go on a low carb diet, they're only giving their bodies one fuel source to burn, and that is fatty acids, or your body can make those fatty acids into ketones, which is why it's called ketogenic type diets. But in order to deliver that many fatty acids to the tissues, your body has to do so via these lipoprotein, these LDL molecules. And so if you only have one fuel source to burn, and that is fats, then your body has to deliver more of those fats to the tissues. So more LDLs are created so that more cholesterol can get delivered to the tissues, or fatty acids can get delivered to the tissues. And so then he basically showed that if he ate white bread, then which is a carbohydrate, and he provided his body with carbohydrates to burn, didn't have to burn as many fatty acids, then the LDL will come down because the body doesn't need to deliver as many of those fatty acids to the tissues because there's carbohydrates present in that white bread. And so basically, what our lipids is showing us, or what we're measuring in our lipids, is basically telling us about what our body's choosing to metabolize at the time. It's not really a reflection of risk of anything. It's basically just telling us what our body's metabolizing. And so Dave has done a study now in his documentary, The Cholesterol Code, discusses this study where he looks at people who have this what he calls lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, where they are generally fit and healthy, but they go on low carb diet and their LDL goes up. And he studied these people, and he continues to study these people, and he's basically shown that despite this high level of LDL with their metabolic health, there's no progression of plaque in their coronary arteries based on imaging. And that study is ongoing for him. And it was famously shown that what your body's metabolizing and what you're eating can dictate what levels of LDL your blood work will show in lean, fitter people. That was famously illustrated in a study, a one-person study done by Nick Norwoods called the Oreo cookie experiment, where he ate Oreo cookies and it lowered his LDL more than a statin drug. because the lipids are much more responsive to what you're metabolizing rather than interfering with the cholesterol production pathway with a statin. So that worked better in eating the Oreos. So very interesting things here. And the reason I say all that is because people who go on low carb diets and they look fit and healthy, and they go into their doctor's office and the doctor looks at them, they see a fit and healthy person, but they may be this lean mass hyperresponder and their LDL is up. The doctor can't think or doesn't know of any other explanation for why that LDL would be up rather than, oh, they must have a genetic predisposition to high LDL. They must have FH. And so the doctor tells them they have FH. Even if they've never done any genetic testing on them whatsoever, they just tell them that's the only reason they can think that they've ever learned that it could be that. And so that's what they tell them. So people come to me saying, oh, my doctor told me I have FH. And I say, oh, do they do genetic testing? And they say no, and I say it's just elevated based on my low carb diet. So, and at this point it's a little bit speculation, but I'm not convinced that because people who go on low carb diets and who are overweight and metabolically unhealthy, they their LDL doesn't go up like that. But then once their low carb diet gets them to a point where they are metabolically healthy, then they start to see the rise in LDL. So I'm not convinced. I think that, again, it's speculation, but I think that this is just what's normal for everybody. It's not necessarily a certain phenotype. It's that when people get metabolically healthy and get fitter, and they're on low carb diets and they're giving their body one fuel source to burn, then their body has to raise the amount of LDL to deliver more fat to the tissues, and we get this elevated LDL. And this could mean, I mean, I'm one of these people, and mine can go up to 500 at times, my total cholesterol, that is, and my LDL has been at 400 before. So yeah, that's just a caveat there that we have to be conscious of. So I say all that because if someone has told you, or a doctor has told you, you have familial hypercholesterolemia, the question is, there's more questions to ask to see if that's actually true. A, have we done genetic testing? B, are you on a low carb diet? Are you metabolically healthy? Those types of things are very important to ask, right? Now, let's say that someone does have the genetic testing and they do, and it does show that they have this genetically high cholesterol, this familial hypercholesterolemia. The question is, does that increase the risk of heart disease? Does this higher LDL level in the blood increase the risk of heart disease? And so let's look at some studies here. So you would expect that if someone had higher cholesterol in the blood, and higher cholesterol in the blood was so causative in heart disease and increased their risk so much, that we'd also see an increased risk of death compared to the general population in these people. However, there was a study in 1966 where they tracked many generations of these people with these genes, these families with these genes, these genetically high cholesterol genes. And what the study concluded was that there was no evidence that familial hypercholesterolemia appreciably shortens the life of affected individuals, and that high LDL levels were clearly compatible with survival into the 7th and 8th decades of life. So even though these people had higher levels of LDL and cholesterol in their blood, they didn't have any shortened lifespans, and they lived into their 7th and 8th decades, just like many people. And that study also showed that the people who did develop issues with their health also were more likely to be inactive, drink alcohol, smoke, things like that. It was lifestyle things that dictated whether or not they had poorer outcomes in health rather than the genetically high cholesterol. Now, another study looked at well, it was that same study. Of the 78 people in the study, only 20 of them developed plaque in the arteries. And so again, like if it was about the cholesterol, all of them would have developed plaque. But in the 78 people they tracked throughout many generations in that study, only 20 of them developed plaque in their arteries. So it suggests there's something other than the high LDL levels, because they all had high LDL levels. Another study from 2001 looked at mortality in those with familial hypercholesterolemia and found that they reached old age, and that hypercholesterolemia may have conferred a survival advantage in times of infection, because there's some studies that show that LDL molecules, the cholesterol in those LDL molecules can help with infections and things like that, help fight those sorts of things. So very interesting. The research is not kind of matching up. Now, there was another study looking at people with familial hypercholesterolemia in Norway, and it concluded no significant differences were noted in all-cause mortality between the FH patients and the general population. They also found that a 40% lower rate of death in the population range of 70 to 79 years old. with people with FH. So 40% lower rate of death in people who had higher cholesterol. Now, this study did show, however, there was a higher rate of death from heart disease with those with FH. So specifically heart disease, there was a higher rate of death in people from heart disease. But was it the LDL that created that increased risk of death? Now, there's other research that shows that it's probably not the LDL. So one study found that in people with FH, the number of people who had a heart attack or did not have a heart attack was exactly the same, right? So again, if it was about the LDL and they all have higher LDL, you'd think that the people who had heart attacks and didn't have heart attacks, there wouldn't be some who did, some who didn't. They all would have an increased risk of it. They also found that in those people with FH, the people that had calcified plaque in their arteries measured by a CC score were much more likely to have a heart attack. So it's about having the plaque, right? But some of them didn't have plaque again. So they all have high LDL. Some of them have plaque, some of them different. But the ones who had the plaque were increased risk of heart attack. Um, However, this study found that calcified plaque in arteries was varied dramatically in people with FH, with nearly half having no detectable plaque, despite lifetime exposure to significantly elevated LDL, right? So it suggests there's some other factor here besides the LDL that's creating risk in some people and not in others. So what could that be? So the answer to this mystery of why some people develop plaque and some people don't, with genetically high cholesterol, is that many studies have shown that those with FH who do get heart disease are much more likely to also have a genetically elevated risk for clotting. So they have this genetically elevated risk for high LDL and cholesterol in the blood, but they also have the people who develop plaque also have a much higher risk, a genetically elevated risk for clotting. They have some genetically higher clotting risk. So whether that's higher fibrinogen or prothrombin or factor VIII or some clotting factor in the clotting cascade, they have a genetically higher risk for those things to be activated and develop clotting. And at the end of the day, when you analyze clotting tissue or you analyze plaque, it's a large proportion of it is clotting tissue. That's what's the mechanism by which this forms. So in this here, which this graph here is from a presentation from David Diamond, who's also written a lot of papers about this coagulation factor being the difference between who gets plaque and who doesn't in people with FH. But you can see it here clearly in this graph that those who have the prothrombin genetic polymorphism have a much higher risk of developing heart disease. So here you can see that total cholesterol, LDL, those people had very similar risks. People who had higher amounts of those in their blood does have similar risks as far as who had heart disease and who didn't. But what made the difference is the people who had the genetic predisposition for clotting with prothrombin, you can see that red bar there on the end, much higher risk for heart disease than those who didn't have that. So that seems to be the thing that dictates whether or not people with FH will get heart disease or not, is the clotting risk, not the LDL. So this makes sense because studies have shown that, again, plaque in arteries is made up of fibrotic clotting tissue, and that fibrin appears to be a multi-potential component of atherogenesis, intervening at virtually all stages of lesion development. So it's not just that it's part of the process along the way, it's the whole process is this fibrosis. So regardless of if someone has FH or doesn't, the most important thing to focus on is preventing heart disease is prevention of clotting mechanisms. Now, medicine would tell you, oh, we can prevent clotting with aspirin or blood thinners or things like that. But there's a much more effective way to do that, and that is create structured water in the arteries, which I'll talk about in other videos and I have talked about on social media and many other lectures, as far as how building structured water actually creates a biophysics way to thin the blood and prevent clotting. But just to real briefly talk about what would do that. What would build that structured water would be infrared light exposure, grounding, exercise, avoiding wireless signals, avoiding toxins, plastics, herbicides, pesticides, heavy metals, things like that, and achieving metabolic health and setting your circadian rhythm. So yeah. That's it for this video. If you want to learn more, subscribe to my YouTube channel or follow me on social media. Or if you want to work with me as a client so you can get all my information and all my guidance, click the link below to learn more about my heart health mentorship program and book a complimentary call with me so we can see if it's a good fit to work together. Stay healthy out there.